The Kalmyk steppe seems sad and lifeless when you see it for the first time, when you come to it full of preoccupations, when you watch it absent-mindedly as the low hills slowly emerge from the horizon and slowly sink back into it. Lieutenant Colonel Derensky had the feeling it was the very same wind-swept hillock that kept appearing in front of him, the very same curve that his car kept following. The horsemen, too, seemed identical, even though some were beardless and others grey-haired, even though some were on dun ponies, others on black. The jeep passed through hamlets and villages, past small houses with tiny windows that sheltered a jungle of geraniums. It looked as though you only had to break the glass for the life-giving air to drain away into the surrounding emptiness, for the thick green of the geraniums to wither and die. The jeep drove past circular yurts with clay-smeared walls, through tall grey feather grass, through prickly camel grass, past white splashes of salt, past the little clouds of dust kicked up by flocks of sheep, past small fires that gave off no smoke and danced in the wind. To someone travelling by jeep, on tyres filled with the smoky air of the city, everything here blurs into a uniform grey. This Kalmyk steppe, which stretches gradually, changing to desert, right to the mouth of the Volga and the shores of the Caspian, has one strange characteristic. The earth and the sky above have reflected one another for so long that they have finally become indistinguishable, like a husband and wife who've spent their whole lives together. It's impossible to tell whether dusty, aluminium grey feather grass has begun to grow on the dull, lustreless blue of the sky, or whether the steppe itself has become impregnated with the sky's blue. Earth and sky have blurred together, dusty and ageless. In the same way, the thick, opaque water of lakes Dats and Bermantasak look like a sheet of salt, while the salt flats look like lakes. And in November and December, before the first snows, it's impossible to tell whether the earth has been dried and hardened by the sun or by frost. All this may account for the number of mirages here. The boundary between air and earth, between water and salt, has been erased. The mind of a thirsty traveller can transform this world with ease. The scorching air becomes elegant bluish stone. The lifeless earth is filled with the gentle murmur of streams. Palm trees stretch out to the horizon, and the terrible sun blends with the clouds of dust to form the golden cupolas of temples and palaces. In a moment of exhaustion, a man can transform this sky and this earth into the world of his dreams. And there's another unexpected side to the steppe. It is also a noble, ancient world. A world where there are no screaming colours or harsh lines, but only a sober, grey-blue melancholy that can rival the colours of a Russian forest in autumn. A world whose soft, undulating hills capture the heart more surely than the peaks of the Caucasus. A world whose small, dark, ancient lakes seem to express the very essence of water more truly than seas or oceans. Everything passes, but there is no forgetting this huge cast-iron sun shining through the evening mist, this bitter wind laden with the scent of wormwood. And the steppe has its own riches. In spring, the young tulip-filled steppe is an ocean of colours. The camel grass is still green, its harsh spines are still soft and tender. This steppe has one other unchanging characteristic. Day and night, summer and winter, in foul weather or fine weather, it speaks of freedom. If someone has lost his freedom, the steppe will remind him of it. Derensky got out of his car and looked at a horseman on top of a small hill. Dressed in a long robe tied by a piece of string, he was sitting on his shaggy pony and surveying the steppe. He was very old. His face looked as hard as stone. Derensky called out to the man and then walked up to him, holding out his cigarette case. The old man turned in his saddle. His movement somehow combined the agility of youth with the thoughtful caution of age. He looked in turn at the hand holding out the cigarettes, at Derensky's face, at the pistol hanging by his side, at the 3 bars indicating his rank, and at his smart boots. Then he took a cigarette and rolled it between his fine brown, childlike fingers. The old man's hard, high-cheekboned face suddenly changed. 2 kind, intelligent eyes looked out from between his wrinkles. There was something very splendid about these old brown eyes, about their look of trust, blended with wary scrutiny. For no apparent reason, Derensky suddenly felt happy and at ease. The pony, who had pricked up his ears suspiciously at Derensky's approach, inquisitively pointed first one ear, then the other, and then smiled at him with his beautiful eyes and his 2 rows of large teeth. "Thank you," said the old man, in a thin voice, putting his hand on Derensky's shoulder. "I had 2 sons in a cavalry division. The first one," he raised his hand a little above the pony's head, "was killed by the Germans. The second one," he lowered his hand a little below the pony's head, "is a machine gunner. He's got 3 medals. How about you? Is your father still alive?" "My mother's alive, but my father's dead." "Ah, that's bad," said the old man, shaking his head. Derensky had the feeling that he wasn't just being polite, that he felt genuinely sad to learn of the death of the father of the Russian lieutenant colonel who had offered him a cigarette. The old man gave a sudden cry, waved his hand in the air, and galloped down the hill with extraordinary grace and speed. What was he thinking as he galloped through the steppe? Of his sons? Of the father of the Russian lieutenant colonel whose jeep needed mending? Derensky watched. One word pounded like blood at his temples. Freedom. 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 Yes, he was envious of the old Kalmyk. Derensky had been sent from front headquarters on a lengthy mission to the army deployed on the extreme left of the flank. These missions were particularly unpopular among the staff officers on account of the lack of water and housing, the poor supplies, the vast distances, and the vile roads. The High Command had little precise information about these troops, lost as they were in the sands between the shores of the Caspian and the Kalmyk steppe. Derensky had a lot of tasks to carry out. After travelling hundreds of miles through the steppe, he felt overwhelmed by melancholy and boredom. Here, no one even dreamed of an offensive. There was something hopeless about the situation of these troops, who had been driven back almost to the end of the world. The continual tension of life at Front HQ, the rumours of an impending offensive, the movements of the reserves, the codes and telegrams, the never-ending work of the signals section, the roar of the columns of tanks and vehicles coming in from the north, had all this really just been an illusion? As Derensky listened to the gloomy conversations of the officers, as he collated and checked data about the state of the equipment, inspected artillery regiments and batteries, noticed the sullenness on the faces of the men and the laziness of their movements, he slowly gave in to the monotonous gloom around him. Russia seemed like a wounded animal that had been driven back into the sand dunes, into steppes fit only for camels. There she was, lying on the harsh earth, impotent, unable ever to rise again. Derensky arrived at army headquarters. A plump-faced, balding young man, wearing a tunic without any insignia of rank, was playing cards with 2 women in uniform, both of them lieutenants. Instead of breaking off as the lieutenant colonel entered the room, they looked at him absent-mindedly and went on with their game. "Why not play a trump or a jack?" Derensky waited for the end of the hand before asking, "Are these the commander's quarters?" He's gone to the right flank. He won't be back till evening, said one of the young women. She looked Derensky up and down. Are you from Front HQ, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel? That's right, said Derensky. With a barely perceptible wink, he asked, Excuse me, but could I see the member of the military Soviet? He's with the commander. He won't be back till evening either, said the second woman. Are you on the artillery staff? That's right. Though she was clearly very much the older of the two, Derensky found the first woman extremely attractive. She was the kind of woman who could look very beautiful and yet, seen from the wrong angle, appear suddenly faded, middle-aged, and dull. She had a fine straight nose and blue eyes that were lacking in warmth. You could tell she knew both her own value and that of other people. Her face looked very young, not a year over 25. But as soon as she frowned or looked thoughtful, you could see the wrinkles at the corners of her lips and the loose skin at her throat. Then she looked at least 45. But her legs, in elegant tailored boots, were quite splendid. All these details, which take some time to recount, were taken in at once by Derensky's experienced eye. The second woman was young but already stout. Taken individually, none of her features was particularly beautiful. Her hair lacked body, her face was very broad, and her eyes were an indeterminate colour. But she was young and feminine. Yes, sitting next to her, even a blind man would be conscious of her femininity. These details too were noted by Derensky in less than a second. More than that, in this fraction of a second he was somehow able to weigh up the merits of the two women and make a choice quite without practical consequences that nearly all men make in such a situation. Though he had a lot of questions on his mind. Where would he find the commanding officer? Would he be able to obtain the necessary information from him? Where could he eat and sleep? Would it be a long and difficult journey to the division on the extreme left? Derensky still had time to say to himself, Yes, that's the one I'd choose. It was merely a passing thought, and yet, instead of going straight to the Chief of Staff, he stayed behind for a game of cards. He ended up partnering the woman with the blue eyes. During the game he learnt several things. His partner was called Alla Sergeyevna. The other woman worked in the first aid post. The young man, Volodya, was a cook in the military Soviet canteen and appeared to be a relative of someone high up. From the very start, Derensky sensed Alla Sergeyevna's power. It was obvious from the way people addressed her when they came into the room. The commanding officer was clearly her husband, not just her lover, as he had first thought. At first he couldn't understand why Volodya was so familiar with her, and then it suddenly dawned on him that Volodya must be the brother of the commander's first wife. What was still unclear was whether the commander's first wife was still alive, and if so, whether they'd got a divorce. The younger woman, Claudia, was equally clearly not the wife of the member of the military Soviet. There was an occasional note of arrogance and condescension in the way Alla Sergeyevna talked to her. Yes, we may be playing cards together. We may call each other T, but that's simply because of the war. Claudia, in turn, had a certain sense of her own superiority over Alla Sergeyevna. Derensky understood this as, all right, I may not be lawfully married, but at least I'm faithful to my member of the military Soviet, so you watch it. You may be properly married, but there are one or two things I could say about you. Volodya made no attempt to hide how strongly he was attracted to Claudia. He seemed to be saying, My love is hopeless. How can a mere cook hope to rival the member of the military Soviet? But even if I am only a cook, I love you with a pure love, and you know it. All I ask is to be able to look into your pretty little eyes. As for what your member of the military Soviet loves you for, that doesn't matter to me. Derensky played very badly, and Alla Sergeyevna took him under her wing. She liked this lean, elegant colonel. He said, I thank you, and mumbled, "Forgive me," if their hands touched during the deal. He looked pained when Volodya wiped his nose on his fingers and his fingers on his handkerchief. He smiled politely at other people's jokes, and was extremely witty himself. After one of his jokes, she said, "You're very witty, but it took me a moment to get the point. I'm losing my mind out here in the steppes." She said this very quietly, as if to let him know, or rather feel, how easily a conversation could develop between the two of them. A conversation that would send shivers up their spines. A conversation of the only kind that matters between a man and a woman. Terensky continued to make mistakes, and she continued to correct him. At the same time, they began to play another game, in which Terensky made no mistakes. Nothing had been said between them except, "No, don't hang on to your low spades," or go on, there's no need to save your trumps." But she already knew and appreciated all his charms, his strength and his gentleness, his discretion and his audacity, his shyness. Alla Sergeyevna sensed these qualities both because of her own perceptiveness and because Terensky knew how to display them. She, for her part, was able to show him that she understood the way he watched her smile, the way he watched her gesture with her hands or shrug her shoulders, the way he looked at her breasts under her elegant gabardine tunic, at her legs, at her carefully manicured nails. And he could tell that her voice was just a little more melodic than usual, that her smile lingered a little longer than usual, so that he could appreciate the beauty of her voice, her white teeth, and the dimples in her cheeks. Terensky was quite shaken by his sudden feeling of excitement. It was something he never got used to. It was always as though he was experiencing it for the first time. His considerable experience of women had never degenerated into mere habit. His experience was one thing, his joy and excitement quite another. It was this that made him a true lover of women. It somehow came about that he had to stay the night at Army headquarters. And the following morning he called on the Chief of Staff, a taciturn colonel who didn't ask a single question about Stalingrad itself or the position of the various fronts. By the end of their conversation, Terensky had come to the conclusion that this colonel would be of no help at all. He asked him to stamp his documents, and then went out to inspect the troops himself. As he got into his jeep, he felt a strange lightness and emptiness in his arms and legs, a total lack of thought or desire. He felt at once sated and drained. Everything round him seemed insipid and empty. The sky, the feathered grass, and the hills that only yesterday had seemed so beautiful. He didn't want to talk or joke with his driver. Even his thoughts about his friends and relatives, about his beloved mother, were somehow cold and lifeless. His thoughts about this war in the desert, at the furthest limits of Russian territory, were equally lacking in passion. Every now and again he spat, shook his head, and muttered with a kind of obtuse surprise, "What a woman!" He thought remorsefully that this kind of affair always came to a bad end. He remembered something he had read, either in Kuprin or in some foreign novel, about love being like a lump of coal. Hot, it burns you. Cold, it makes you dirty. He wanted to cry, or rather to have a good moan, to find someone he could tell his troubles to. It wasn't his own choice, it was the will of fate. This was the only kind of love he knew. Then he fell asleep. When he woke up, he thought suddenly, well, if I don't get myself killed, I'll certainly drop in on Alochka on the way back. On his way back from work, Major Yershov stopped by Mostovskoy's place on the bedboards. "One of the Americans heard the radio today. Our resistance at Stalingrad has really upset the German strategy." Then he frowned and added, And there was a report from Moscow, something about the liquidation of the Comintern. "You must be crazy," said Mostovskoy, looking into Yersov's intelligent eyes that were like the cool, turbid waters of spring. "Oh, maybe the Americans got it mixed up," said Yersov, scratching his head. "Maybe the Comintern's been expanded." During his life, Mostovskoy had known several people who were like a diaphragm that resonated to the thoughts, ideals, and passions of a whole society. Not one important event ever seemed to pass them by. Yershov was just such a person. He was a mouthpiece for the thoughts and aspirations of the whole camp. But a rumour about the liquidation of the Comintern didn't hold the least interest for this master of men's minds. Brigade Commissar Osipov, who had been responsible for the political education of a large military unit, was equally indifferent. "General Gudz said that it was because of your internationalist propaganda that all this funk first set in. We should have brought people up in the spirit of patriotism, the spirit of Russia." "You mean God, the Tsar, and the fatherland?" said Moskovskoy mockingly. "Nonsense," said Osipov nervously. "Anyway, who cares about orthodoxy? What matters, dear comrade, is that the Germans are skinning us alive." The Spanish soldier, known to the Russians as Andriushka, who slept on the third tier of boards, wrote Stalingrad on a scrap of wood and gazed at the word during the night. In the morning he turned it over in case the capos caught sight of it as they came by on their rounds. "If I wasn't sent out to work, I used to lie on the boards all day long," Major Kirillov told Mostovskoy. "But now I wash my shirt, and I chew splinters of pine wood against scurvy." The SS officers, known as the Happy Lads, because of the way they sang on their way to work, now picked on the Russians with even more cruelty than usual. There were invisible links between the barrack huts and the city on the Volga. But no one was interested in the Comintern. It was around then that the émigré Chernetsov approached Moskovskoy for the first time. Covering up his empty eye socket with the palm of his hand, he began talking about the broadcast the American had heard. Mostovskoy was pleased. He needed to talk about this very badly. "The sources aren't very reliable," he said. "It's probably just a rumour." Chernetsov raised his eyebrows. It looked grotesque. An eyebrow raised in neurotic bewilderment over an empty socket. "What do you mean?" he asked. "It makes perfect sense. Our masters, the Bolsheviks, set up the Third International, and our masters, the Bolsheviks, developed the theory of so-called socialism in one country. That theory is a contradiction in terms, like fried ice. Georgy Plekhanov wrote in one of his last articles, socialism either exists as an international, worldwide system or not at all." "So-called socialism?" repeated Mostovskoy. "That's right, so-called Soviet socialism." Chernetsov smiled, and saw Mostovskoy smile back. They recognized their past in these jibes, in this mockery and hatred. The sharp blade of their youthful enmity flashed out anew, as though cutting through whole decades. This meeting in a concentration camp reminded them not only of years of hatred, but also of their youth. This man, for all his hostility, knew and loved what Mostovskoy had known and loved in his youth. It was Chernetsov, not Osipov or Yershov, who remembered the first party congress, and names that everyone else had long ago forgotten. They talked excitedly about the relations between Marx and Bakunin, about what Lenin and Plekhanov had said about the hardliners and the softs on the editorial staff of Iskra. How warmly Engels had welcomed the young Russian Social Democrats who had come to visit him when he was a blind old man. What a pain Lyobotchka Axelrod had been in Zurich. Evidently sharing the same feelings as Mostovskoy, the one-eyed Menshevik grinned and said, "Touching accounts have been written of meetings between old friends. What about meetings between old enemies, between tired, grey-haired old dogs like you and me?" Mostovskoy glimpsed a tear on Chernetsov's cheek. They both knew that they would die soon. The events of their lives would be levelled over. Their enmity, their convictions, their mistakes would all be buried beneath the sand. Yes, said Mostovskoy, if you fight against someone all your days, he becomes a part of your life. How strange to meet in this wolf pit, said Chernetsov. Then, apropos of nothing at all, he murmured, What wonderful words! Wheat, corn, April showers. This camp's a terrible place, said Mostovskoy. He laughed. Anything else seems good in comparison, even meeting a Menshevik. Chernetsov nodded sadly. Yes, things are hard for you. Hitlerism, said Mostovskoy. I never imagined there could be such a hell. Don't try and fool me, said Chernetsov. There's not much you don't know about terror. The melancholy warmth of only a moment before might never have existed. They began to argue furiously and without mercy. The terrible thing about Chernetsov's slander was that it contained an element of truth. What he did was to extrapolate general laws from occasional mistakes and incidental cruelties. Of course, it suits you to think that some people went too far in 1937, he said to Mostovskoy, that the success of collectivization went to people's heads, that your great and beloved leader is perhaps just a little cruel and megalomaniac. But the truth of the matter is very different. It's precisely Stalin's monstrous inhumanity that makes him Lenin's successor. As you love to repeat, Stalin is the Lenin of today. You still think that the workers' lack of rights and the poverty in the villages are something temporary, just growing pains, but you're the true kulaks. You're the true monopolists. The wheat you buy from a peasant for 5 kopecks a kilo and sell back to him for a ruble a kilo is the foundation stone of your whole socialist edifice. So, even you, an émigré and a Menshevik, admit that Stalin is the Lenin of today, retorted Mostovskoy. It's true, we are the heirs to all the generations of Russian revolutionaries, from Pugachev to Razin. The heir to Razin, Dobrolюбов and Herzen is Stalin, not your renegade Mensheviks. Fine heirs you make, said Chernetsov. Do you realize the meaning of the elections for the Constituent Assembly? After 1,000 years of slavery, during our entire millennium, Russia has been free for little more than 6 months. Your Lenin didn't inherit Russian freedom, he destroyed it. When I think of the trials of 1937, I remember a very different legacy. Do you remember the secret police chief, Colonel Sudeikin? He and Degaev hoped to terrify the Tsar by inventing conspiracies and then seize power themselves. And you think of Stalin as the heir to Herzen? You must be mad, said Mostovskoy. Are you serious about Sudeikin? What about the Great Social Revolution, the expropriation of the expropriators? The factories seized from the capitalists, the land seized from the gentry. Has all that passed you by? Whose legacy is that? Sudeikin's? And the way the workers and peasants have entered every sphere of social activity. Do you call that a legacy from Sudeikin? I almost pity you. I know, said Chernetsov. One can't argue with facts, but one can explain them. You're marshals and writers, you're doctors of science, you're people's commissars, are servants not to the proletariat, but of the state. And as for the people who work in the fields and on the shop floors, I don't think even you would have the nerve to call them masters. Fine masters they make. He leaned toward Mostovskoy. Incidentally, there's only one of you I really respect, and that's Stalin. He's a real man. The rest of you are just sissies. He understands the true basis of socialism in one country. Iron terror, labour camps, and medieval witch trials. I've heard all this shit before, said Mostovskoy, but I must say there's something particularly nasty about your way of putting things. Only a man who's lived in your home since he was a child and then been thrown out onto the street can be that despicable. And do you realise what that man is? A lackey. He stared hard at Chernetsov. Still, I'd wanted to talk about what brought us together in 1898, not what separated us in 1903. Ah, so that's what you wanted, is it? A cosy little chat about the days before the lackey was sent packing? At that, Mostovskoy really did get angry. Yes, that's just it. A runaway lackey. A lackey who's been thrown out onto the street wearing kid gloves. We don't wear gloves. We got nothing to hide. We plunge our hands into dirt and blood. We came to the workers' movement without Pikhanov's kid gloves. What use have those gloves been to you, anyway? 30 pieces of silver for some articles in the Socialist Messenger. While the whole camp, the English, the French, the Poles, the Norwegians, and the Dutch, believes in us. The salvation of the world lies in our hands, in the power of the Red Army, the army of freedom. And is that how it's always been? Interrupted Chernetsov. What about the pact with Hitler, and the invasion of Poland in 1939, and the way your tanks crushed Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and the invasions of Finland? Your army and Stalin have taken back everything that was given to the small nations by the revolution. And what about the suppression of the peasant rebellions in Eastern Asia? And Kronstadt? Was that in the name of freedom and democracy? Mostovskoy held his hand up to Chernetsov's face. I've already told you, we don't wear kid gloves. Chernetsov nodded. Do you remember Strelnikov, the political police chief? He didn't wear kid gloves either. He had revolutionaries beaten up till they were half dead, and then wrote out false confessions. What was the purpose of 1937? You say we were preparing to fight Hitler. Was your teacher Marx or Strelnikov? Ah, none of your filth surprises me, said Mostovskoy. It's what I've come to respect. But you know what does surprise me? Why should the Nazis put you in a camp? They hate us frenziedly, that's clear enough. But why should Hitler imprison you and your friends? Once again, as at the very beginning of the conversation, Chernetsov smiled. Well, he said, they haven't let me go yet. Maybe you should get up a petition for my release. Mostovskoy was in no mood for joking. No, you shouldn't be in one of Hitler's camps, not with the hatred you bear us. Nor should this character. He pointed at Ikonikov, who was making his way towards them. Ikonikov's hands and face were smeared with clay. He held out some dirty sheets of paper covered in writing and said, Have a look through this. Tomorrow I might be dead. All right, but why have you decided to leave us so suddenly? Do you know what I've just heard? The foundations we've been digging are for gas ovens. Today we began pouring the concrete. Yes, said Chernetsov, there were rumours about that when we were laying the railway tracks. He looked round. Mostovskoy thought Chernetsov must be wondering whether the men coming in from work had noticed how straightforwardly and naturally he was talking to an old Bolshevik. He probably felt proud to be seen like this by the Italians, Norwegians, Spanish and English, and above all by the Russian prisoners of war. But how can people carry on working? Asked Ikonikov. How can we help prepare such a horror? Chernetsov shrugged his shoulders. Do you think we're in England or something? Even if 8,000 people refused to work, it wouldn't change anything. They'd be dead in less than an hour. No, said Ikonikov, I can't. I just can't do it. Then that's the end of you, said Mostovskoy. He's right, said Chernetsov. This comrade knows very well what it means to attempt to instigate a strike in a country where there's no democracy. His argument with Mostovskoy had upset him. Here, in the Nazi camp, the phrases he had repeated so often in his Paris apartment sounded absurd. They rang false even in his ears. The other prisoners were always repeating the word Stalingrad. Like it or not, the fate of the world hung on that city. A young Englishman had made a victory sign and said, I'm praying for you all. Stalingrad's halted the avalanche. Words like these made Chernetsov feel happy and excited. He turned to Mostovskoy. Heine said that only a fool reveals his weaknesses to an enemy. Very well, maybe I am a fool, but you're right. I do understand the meaning of the struggle being fought by your army. That's a bitter admission for a Russian socialist. It's hard to both rejoice and suffer, to hate you but feel pride in your achievements. He looked at Mostovskoy. For a moment it seemed as though even his good eye had filled with blood. But do you really not understand, even here, that man cannot live without freedom and democracy? Come on now, said Mostovskoy sternly. That's enough of your hysterics. He looked round. Chernetsov thought Mostovskoy must be wondering whether the men coming in from work had noticed how straightforwardly and naturally he was talking to a Menshevik, an émigré. He probably felt ashamed to be seen like this by the foreigners, and above all, by the other Russians. Chernetsov's blind, bloody pit stared at Mikhail Sidorovitch Mostovskoy. Ikonikov reached up and grasped the bare foot of the priest sitting on the second tier of boards. Que dois-je faire, mio padre? He asked. Nous travaillons dans un Vernichtungslager. Gardy's cold black eyes looked round at the three men. Tout le monde travaille là-bas, et moi je travaille là-bas. Nous sommes des esclaves, he said slowly. Dieu nous pardonnera. C'est son métier, added Mostovskoy. Mais ce n'est pas votre métier, said Gardy reproachfully. But that's just it, Mikhail Sidorovitch. You too think you're going to be forgiven, said Ikonikov, hurrying to get the words out and ignoring Gardy. But me? I'm not asking for absolution of sins. I don't want to be told that it's the people with power over us who are guilty, that we're innocent slaves, that we're not guilty because we're not free. I am free. I'm building a Vernichtungslager, a concentration camp, a death camp. I have to answer to the people who will be gassed here. I can say no. There's nothing can stop me. As long as I can find the strength to face my destruction, I will say no. Je dirai non, mio padre. Je dirai non. Gardy placed his hands on Ikonikov's grey head. Donnez-moi votre main, he said. Now the shepherd's going to admonish the lost sheep for his pride, said Chernetsov. Mostovskoy nodded. But rather than admonishing Ikonikov, Gardy lifted his dirty hand to his lips and kissed it.